Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's session, sponsored by the National Council of Urban Indian Health. Next slide. Today, we proudly present a nonpartisan event funded by the National Urban Indian Family Coalition Center. Today's topic is going to cover moving your votes into action, advocacy tools to amplify your voice, and I will be your host for this evening. My name is Zipporah Fuller. I am Navajo from White Host, Arizona, Northern Arizona. I am the Director of Technical Assistance here at NCUIH. Next slide. So just a little bit about the National Council of Urban Indian Health. We are the only national nonprofit organization devoted to the support and development of quality, accessible, and culturally competent healthcare services for American Indians and Alaska Natives living in urban settings. We were established in 1998 by urban Indian leaders who were looking to advance the healthcare of American Indians and Alaska Natives. Currently, we advocate for Indian healthcare with Congress and federal government, which would be today's topic. We also do provide technical support to UIOs for implementing quality, accessible healthcare services, and we also provide technical assistance to support our 41 Title V urban Indian organizations across the nation. Next slide. Okay, please continue moving forward. So the healthcare and federal trust responsibility between the federal government and our tribal nations is historical and unique. Much of the legal relationships that stem from our tribes is based on treaties, laws, and Supreme Court decisions that allow us to receive funding from the federal government for our Indian health service programs. Areas of opportunity include health reform, which offers new opportunities to access health insurance to American Indian and Alaska Native citizens and employees. And we also have, if you could click, yep, we have the Indian Health Service who offers healthcare to American Indian and Alaska Natives on or near Indian reservations and in some urban Indian communities. Next slide. So how American Indians and Alaska Natives receive healthcare is founded on the principle of ITU. The I stands for the Indian Health Service, which is a federal agency, and they provide direct care via IHS clinics and hospitals throughout the nation. They also provide funds to the tribal and urban centers to provide direct care, which is also known as compact services. In addition to that, we also do have tribal sovereign nations, and they also contract with the Indian Health Service for IHS to provide some of their services. These are also otherwise known as Tribal 638 hospitals. And again, they also compact with IHS to receive IHS funds. Underneath that, you then see it gets smaller, and those are the 41 urban Indian organizations that are nonprofit. They compact with Indian Health Service to receive IHS funds to provide direct care. So those would be the urban Indians within your state. For example, in the state of Arizona, we have 3, including Native Health, NACA, as well as the Tucson Indian Center. Next slide, please. Currently, we are in an election year, and right now we are working toward ensuring that the 3.5 million plus voters of American Indian and Alaska Native peoples throughout the United States have a voice. We do have 4 American Indian and Alaska Natives in nationwide office, which includes Congresswoman Deb Haaland, Congressman Tom Cole, Congresswoman Sharice Davids, and Congressman Mark Wayne Mullen. There are currently 12 candidates that are American Indian and Alaska Natives running for nationwide office in 2020, and this is the most that have run in any year in history. Your vote could make the difference. Did you know that your local urban Indian health center works with your state and local Congress representatives for funding and programs advocacy? Next slide, please. In turn, the people that you vote into office can help push platforms that bring awareness, resolution, and funding to Indian country. Currently, we have had several initiatives get passed, with the biggest being Savannah's Act and the Violence Against Women Act. Those are just 2 of several laws that are in or coming out of the 116th Congress of the United States this year. They reform law enforcement protocols, address the high number of missing and murdered Native women, and aim to help to prevent domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. In addition to that, in the healthcare sector, the Healthcare Access for Urban Native Veterans Act expands access to healthcare for AIAN veterans in urban areas by partnering with the VA and the Department of Defense. Additionally, the Special Diabetes Programs for Indians helps fund effective IHS health programs for diabetes prevention and treatment. The folks that you vote into office, as well as their agendas, help to push and make these platforms and initiatives a reality. Next slide, please. Today, we have the pleasure of two of our attorneys here at NCUIH who will provide an overview. The first is Sunny Stevenson. She is an enrolled member of the Walker Paiute tribe. She has over 15 years of experience in advocacy and is passionate about providing a voice to those who have been historically silenced. Her practical experience spans child welfare, juvenile law, civil rights mediation, criminal defense, corporate health plan operations, and health policy. In 2017, the California Rural Indian Health Board nominated Sunny for a State Luna Wessel Leadership Award in recognition of her outstanding service and commitment in efforts to improve the health status of American Indian and Alaska Native people. She earned a Juris Doctor degree with a concentration in advocacy from the University of the Pacific, McGeorge School of Law, and a Bachelor of Science degree in Child Development with a psychology minor from California Polytechnic State University, San Luis Obispo. Sunny's proudest accomplishment is her brilliant, funny, and kind teenage son. Next slide, please. Joining us as well is Julia Dreyer. Ms. Dreyer is a public policy professional with a decade of public policy experience. Ms. Dreyer is originally from the Milwaukee area and received her undergraduate degree in general business management from the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, and her Juris Doctorate at the George Washington University Law School. Prior to NCUIH, she served as in-house counsel at a trade association focusing primarily on federal regulatory and policy issues, including preparing regulatory comments and working with federal agencies as well as litigation. Next slide, please. Please join me in welcoming Julia Dreyer as we begin our Moving Your Votes into Action, Advocacy Tools to Amplify Your Voice presentation.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who is joining us. My name is Julia Dreyer, and we're going to get started with just an overview of where you can advocate. So here on this slide, we do have the three branches of government. People like to say Congress makes the laws and the agencies or the executive branch implement the laws. Next slide, please. So first we'll go over Congress and how the congressional process works in terms of passing laws and how you can use your tools and advocate to Congress. So in the 116th Congress, we have the two chambers, the Senate and the House of Representatives, and this slide just shows what the current makeup of both of those chambers of Congress are. Next slide, please. Both the House of Representatives and the Senate have committees. Each committee has jurisdiction over certain areas, and there's also subcommittees that handle specific areas of the committee's work. You can find more information on some of the different committees on the senate.gov or house.gov websites. Next slide, please. So here's an example of some Senate committees. If you were to identify a problem with American Indian Alaska Native health policy, what committees might you contact? And looking through this list, one that would stand out is the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. In the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs has jurisdiction over Indian issues. In the House of Representatives, there's not a specific committee for Indian Affairs, and the work actually falls into a lot of different committees. But in the Senate, as you can see, there's some other committees here that may be relevant, including health, education, labor, and pensions. Next slide, please. So next, we're going to go over the legislative process. And next slide. First, what is a bill? A bill is what it's the form used for most legislation. And let's say if it originates in the House of Representatives, it's denoted with a number after HR. If it's in the Senate, it would be S and then number. For this illustration, we will assume a bill starts in the House of Representatives before going to the Senate. But it is possible for it to start in the Senate or for it to be progressing in both chambers concurrently as well. Next slide, please. Any member in the House of Representatives may introduce a bill at any time. It simply gets placed in the hopper, and the sponsor or person introducing it must have a signature on the bill. A public bill can have an unlimited number of co-sponsoring members. They can join when the bill is introduced, and then they're called original co-sponsors, or they can join at a later point while the bill is being considered. Next slide, please. So once a bill is introduced, the first step in the process of getting it passed is usually a public hearing. So committee members, and again, going back to some of the committees that we talked about, they will hear witnesses representing various viewpoints on the measure at hand. After the hearings, the bill is in a markup session. At this point, members of the committee will study the viewpoints presented in detail and may offer amendments to the bill and actually change some of the text of the bill. They will then vote to accept or reject these changes and vote to determine whether the bill will continue forward, will pass out of committee, or if it will be tabled, which means no further action on it will occur. Next slide, please. Once it passes through committee, a bill then, if it is going to continue, will go to the House floor and be considered by the entire House of Representatives. After all the debate is concluded before the entire House of Representatives and amendments are decided upon, it votes on final passage. And if this passes, then the bill has effectively passed the House, and the next step is it must pass the Senate in the same form, in which case it can become law. So let's go to the next slide, please. The Senate process is a mirror of what happens in the House. So it will be referred to committee, will pass out of committee, and then go before the entire Senate. Next slide. If a bill passes the House and in the Senate, there are some amendments or something else that happens, if the Senate version is slightly different, then it goes to conference. And the two chambers of Congress must come to an agreement and come up with the same bill that passes both chambers. At this point, it is sent to the president. Next slide, please. And the president will sign the bill into law, and that's when it becomes a law. And we can move on, please. Thank you. I'm going to pass it to Sunny Stevenson to talk a little bit about the executive branch and agencies.
Thanks, Julia. So here we have a display of the executive branch. The president appoints secretaries to his cabinet representing major agencies, as you can see listed here. Next slide. So at NCUIH, that's our acronym for the National Council of Urban Indian Health. At NCUIH, some of the key agencies we work with fall under the Department of Health and Human Services, including the Indian Health Service, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. That's just a few. We also work with the Veterans Affairs and the Department of Interior. Next slide. So here's a slide representing the structure of the Indian Health Service. This one right here is the headquarters organizational chart. This is the agency that we work with most closely. So types of administrative policy, there's regulations, that's the rulemaking. This requires notice and comment. And in the next slide, I'll go over that more a bit. There's guidance, sub-regulatory guidance, or policy statements that generally don't have binding effect on regulated entities. Executive orders may direct agencies to promulgate regulations, and then they would be subject to the Administrative Procedure Act or rulemaking. But ordinarily, they're not subject to APA notice and comment. And all of these actions have limitations and can be subject to judicial review. Next slide. So a little bit more about the rulemaking process. They're going to be based on statutes that are enacted through legislation. They're going to be initiated by the agency. There's a draft proposal, and this is published in the Federal Register. Sometimes there's an advance notice of a proposed rule. Sometimes there's an opportunity for public comments. And then after a certain amount of time, a final rule will be issued, and the agencies must consider relevant public comments. That's why it's so important to comment, to make your voice heard during this process. After a final rule is issued, there will be an executive review and then publication. And this is there's typically a 30-day delay in the effective date for that, or even 60 days if it's a significant or large rule. Next slide. So here's a bit about confer and consultation. There's a lot of language on here, but it's so important. So as you know, the federal government has a trust obligation to provide health care to American Indian and Alaska Native people. And as part of this, the agencies engage in tribal consultation. So each agency has its own tribal consultation procedures, but on the urban side at NCUIH, what we do, we engage with the Indian Health Service in a separate process to get input from urban Indian organizations, and that's called Urban Confer. The requirement for Urban Confer is found in the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. Next slide. So how can you help? What can you do? You can advocate. And so there's a few ways to do this, actually many, but let's go over some. So legislatively, you can meet with your representatives, write letters on issues you care about, and do other things to get your message out. On the regulatory side, you can establish contacts with agencies. You can also write letters or comments during the rulemaking process that we went over a moment ago. And you can also mobilize your community, grassroots, use media, letters, and articles. Next slide. So a step-by-step guide to meeting with Congress. This is a crash course right here, but you can look up your representatives on the senate.gov or house.gov website, just using your zip code. You can call or email the office to make an appointment, and you're going to want to explain your ties to their district and let them know that you would like to meet with them briefly to discuss your issues. So congressional members have staffers for every issue. So we work with Native American affairs or health staffers usually, or both, if it's something that's relevant to both. But when you set up the meeting, you will be meeting with a staffer most of the time, not the actual representative, and that's okay. That's expected. If you do meet your representative, that is special because they're very busy people. You're going to want to prepare any materials that could help educate the staffer on the issue. If possible, explain how this affects their constituents directly. That's really important. You're going to want to make sure that you know their stance on the issues that you're bringing up. You want to research their stance, and that's in bold for a reason on this slide, because you want to know where they already stand. So next slide. So some considerations for selecting a member of Congress to contact. So in Congress, there is a Native American caucus. You can look up the members of the Native American caucus, and any one of them, even if they're not your representative, is somebody good to talk to. You also want to look at the leadership for any committees or subcommittees, the chairs or the ranking members on those relevant committees. You want to look at members who are already supportive of your community and already supportive of what your request is, and as well as we look at members who are already representing urban Indian communities, and finally members who are on a committee that's overseeing a bill that you have interest in. Next slide. write, exclamation point. If you cannot get a meeting, write a letter, and that's especially important right now since we're all living on Zoom. Email is the most efficient way to send the letter to the person who handles the issues you are addressing. You can also organize a letter writing campaign and involve your community. And you could also write a letter to the editor in your local paper or get media coverage otherwise. Do op-eds as well. There's a lot of opportunities though with writing. Next slide. So regulatory advocacy, again, so agency rulemakings are typically posted on regulations.gov. In order to find out some proposed rules and different things that are coming out, you want to join email lists from the relevant agencies and then also from organizations that are engaged in the same type of work. And go ahead and contact these organizations too to see if you can help. And then the Indian Health Service posts Dear Tribal and Urban Leader letters on their website for when there's chances for a consultation or confer. Next slide. So what to include in written materials. You want to give a brief introduction, why this matters to you, why they should listen to you. Keep it simple. You want to highlight your point, include the authority, why must or why should the policymaker take action? What's the obligation? Is it because of a trust responsibility or is there a statute? Include a solution. What action do you want them to take? So you're not just writing to complain, you want to be a solution-oriented constituent. You want to keep it professional, and you want to leave, if you're talking to a congressional office, you want to leave behind a one-pager. You want to have a little bit of information that somebody can go to after they're done speaking with you, or if you're sending an email, if you have a one-page information sheet, that's going to be helpful for them. And on the agency or executive side, when you're writing comments, keep them relevant. And then for unsolicited letters, there are opportunities to propose different rules based on what's going on in certain agencies or how they're structured through petitions or different actions like that. But normally unsolicited letters, unless they're going to the right person or someone who's open to it, probably the best use of your energy would probably be to just comment on an open opportunity for comment. Next slide. So here we have links to the NCUIH regulatory and legislative trackers. They speak for themselves. Next slide. And don't forget about your state and local governments. These are very important sources to actually get things done in your local community. So don't forget to do some advocacy close to home. And I'll pass it back to Julia.
Thank you so much, Sunny. So next, I want to talk a little bit about how policy is fluid and really what you're advocating for and what your needs are may change over time. And so to discuss this, we're going to use COVID-19 as a case study. So the question here is, as the pandemic spreads in the United States, what policy tools do you use to help urban Indian organizations, which are the constituents NCUIH represents, prevent, prepare for, and respond to COVID-19? Thank you. And here are some of the key dates. So on January 31st, the Department of Health and Human Services Secretary declared a public health emergency. The first COVID-19 relief bill from Congress was on March 6th. The 13th of March, the President declared a national emergency. The second COVID-19 package was signed into law on March 18th, and the third one on March 27th. And then April 24th, the fourth COVID-19 package was signed into law. So as you can see, things moved very quickly from start to finish as the pandemic entered the United States and spread across the country. Next slide, please. So how did NCUIH respond? We started with identification of UIO's needs. So we held a call early on with executives from urban Indian organizations to identify their current needs, their perceived future needs, even up through testing, supplies for their community, as well as the practitioners and staff at their facilities. Also access to a vaccine once that was available, any community outreach needs, etc. We then took this information and used it in our advocacy to Congress. So we sent multiple letters to members of Congress using some of the same tools that Sunny discussed earlier in terms of targeting different congressional members. We sent a lot of written communications and emails as well. And this is a continuous process. We are still, to date, communicating with members of Congress about the needs as they evolve and as the pandemic continues. We also provided testimony. So at some of the hearings that we discussed earlier in this presentation, we had the opportunity to have NCUIH witnesses to provide testimony on the record to members of Congress. In addition, we advocated to agencies. So once Congress passed these COVID-19 relief bills, then there were funds provided to agencies to disseminate to their communities, as well as Indian healthcare providers. So it was important for us to also be advocating to agencies and identifying and communicating the needs that urban programs had during this pandemic and are still having. We also facilitated stakeholder opportunities by co-hosting listening sessions and providing an opportunity for urban Indian organizations to have dialogue with agencies, direct dialogue. And we participated in convenings that agencies held. The result of all of this work, tribal communities, urban centers, and other Native organizations have received COVID-19 funding due in large part to our joint advocacy efforts. And one other thing that I want to highlight here as well is that we also worked with coalitions. So we worked with other partners in making similar requests. We joined with the National Congress of American Indians and National Indian Health Board in supporting coalition letters of needs for Indian country, and that only strengthened the messages that we were sending. Next slide, please. So here's a summary of it, and your votes and your advocacy can really create change. Advocacy works. UIOs have thus far received a total of $103 million from IHS and $8 million for CDC to respond to COVID-19. Advocacy is continuous. Much more is needed, and NCUIH will continue to advocate. And also, advocacy is a process. Working with Congress, the administration, agency officials, and coalitions of organizations with shared interests really increases the reach of your message and increases the likelihood that you'll get a positive response and get some of the resources that you're seeking. Next slide, please. And thank you. I'm going to pass it back off. Thank you all so much for listening to that section of our presentation. I hope that you learned some good information and that you'll be able to take some of these, some of this new information and use it to advocate.
Thank you so much, Julia and Sunny, for sharing your expertise with us today. We really wanted to aim for a short and sweet presentation so that others could be able to advocate within their communities, take all of this information back. And after the election is over, please know that your advocacy does not end with your vote. You can continue on to advocate for additional initiatives that are going on. We at NCUIH often have to work on the Hill, make sure that our voices are getting heard, utilizing the needs that you let your urban Indian health centers know as you go into your preventative care, your preventative maintenance, your diabetes maintenance. A lot of this advocacy will play into your favor so that we can get more funding into your hands and into your communities. So please, please, please make sure that you guys do show up at the polls this year. It's really important to have your voice heard. Next slide, please. We do have a call for action, which is just to participate in our Native people count. We do encourage you to register to vote if you can. There is a special link there that you are able to use at the www.whenweallvote.org/NUIFC/. Or if you've already registered to vote, if you could just check your voter registration as well. For those of you guys who have requested the early voting ballot or the absentee ballot, Please try and get those in as soon as possible. The United States Postal Service has requested for you to make sure you have those in by today in order to make it to the polls for counting. And also please remember to use these images in your social media. And if you could please use the hashtag Native People Count. And if you could also please tag 5 other people so they can also do the same thing on their social media accounts. Next slide, please. Today's session was made possible with funding from the National Urban Indian Family Coalition. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great evening, all.